So apparently my reading life has been absolute chaos. In the last few weeks I've gone from dark fantasy and dark academia to memoirs about leaving the ultra-orthodox community to rereading both Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings entirely in Hebrew like some kind of literary goblin who has too much free time on his hands. And honestly, it's probably been one of the most interesting reading stretches I've ever been on, or I've had for a really long time. So here is a proper catch-up. What I've been reading, what surprised me, what disappointed me slightly, and why somehow I ended up reading Tolkien in two completely different versions of Hebrew, because apparently I decided normal hobbies are no longer enough. First up, The Death Spell by Lyons. This is book 2 in a series. If you saw my video about the first book, you already know I was really impressed by how strong that opening installment was. Book 2, thankfully, avoids a lot of things that fantasy sequels do when they sort of stall. You know the type. Book 1 builds something like a fantastical world, introduces all these threads, creates genuine intrigue, and then Book 2 shows up, and it's like, what if I spent 400 pages slowly walking between locations while everyone vaguely hints at future events? This does not do this. If anything, the writing here feels sharper and more confident. The intrigue is building naturally. The stakes feel like they're escalating without becoming ridiculous, and there's a wonderful sense that this world has a lot of history. There's something fantasy either nails or completely fails at. So you can always tell when a fantasy world feels like it was built backwards from plot outline versus what it feels like to exist before the page. This one feels old. And not old in the sense that the characters occasionally say a long time ago, and we're supposed to accept it. No, it feels layered and lived in. Like there are stories buried beneath the story you're currently reading. And honestly, I'm finding myself more invested in every chapter, which is genuinely rare. Usually by book 2, well, I'm already mentally checking if the series starts declining by book 3. BookTube has traumatized me. Then The Orchard. Now, I did mention this in another video, but I wanted to revisit here because it's part of this list. This is dark academia. And I need to be careful saying that because dark academia readers can be very defensive if you compare anything to the secret histories. You whisper Donna Tartt's name 3 times and suddenly someone appears in your comments explaining aesthetics, elitism, and the I don't know, the philosophy behind the importance of expensive wool coats. But genuinely, this is the first dark academia novel I've read in recent years that comes close to scratching that same itch. And the reasons it works is because it's not just copying a formula, although it took notes. It brings some genuine distance for its focus on Orthodox Judaism. That perspective gives it texture and atmosphere and feels different from the usual dark academia settings. It's not just wealthy students behaving badly in vaguely gothic interiors while quoting dead philosophers, which, to be fair, is a genre I would probably continue reading until I die. But its biggest issue, though, is it can't quite decide what it wants to be. It feels caught between young adult and adult literary fiction. And that's a very difficult line to walk, because you're trying to occupy both spaces at once. Sometimes you end up fully committed to neither. And there are moments where the writing and thematic depth lean very literary fiction. And there are moments where it pulls back and it feels noticeably young adult in structure and execution. I keep waiting for it to choose, to be fully committed, but it never quite does. Which is frustrating because it comes very, very close to being something exceptional. Still absolutely worth reading if dark academia is your thing. Just maybe go in expecting a very strong, almost masterpiece rather than an actual masterpiece. Which, ironically, is how most dark academia makes me feel. It's a genre built entirely on immaculate vibes and emotional disappointment. And I love the secret histories. Then I read The Brooklyn Odyssey by Zalman Newfield. This is probably the quietest book I've read recently, and I mean that as a compliment. It's a memoir about his journey from leaving the ultra-Orthodox community, which on paper sounds like it could be easy because there is a lot of books built around outrage and the spectacle of it and trauma. A lot of memoirs in this space understandably lean heavy into trauma escape, metaphorical rapture. This doesn't. It reflects, it measures, it's human. It's not trying to shock you. It's trying to understand itself, and I really appreciate that. There's a softness and a humour to this writing that makes it feel deeply personal without becoming performative. It's not interesting it's not interested in turning lived experiences into content. It's interested in an honest explanation. And honestly, that restraint gives it more power. I'm going to say this, just look up Zalman on YouTube because hearing him speak adds another layer to his work. There's something about seeing this person behind the memoir that makes the whole thing resonate more deeply. And then the completely normal and very reasonable thing I did, I reread the entire Harry Potter series in Hebrew, because apparently that's who I am now. At some point, this stopped being a reading habit and become this strange academic side quest no one asked me to undertake. There isn't much I can say about these books that has been said by basically every human with internet access, but rereading them in another language is genuinely interesting. You notice the changes. Not huge narrative changes, obviously, but cultural texture. Different references land differently. Certain phrases carry different weight. Some moments gain something, others lose something. Translation is interesting because it's never just conversion, it's interpretation. And you're seeing how another language, another cultural framework rebuilds the same story. And with something as globally familiar as Harry Potter, those differences become especially noticeable. And it made me realise just how deeply these books are wired into my brain. There are entire scenes that my brain has basically auto-filled the English text while my eyes were reading the Hebrew. Which either means I've read these books way too many times or I desperately need a hobby involving sunlight, or probably both. Now, speaking of wildly unnecessary reads, I reread the entirety of the Lord of the Rings trilogy twice in Hebrew, 2 different translations, because if we're committed to strange literary experiments, apparently moderation is for cowards. The first was an older translation from the late 70s into the early 80s, and this version is intensely biblical in its Hebrew. Reading it feels like discovering Tolkien's manuscripts in a cave somewhere in the Holy Lands and deciding this was sacred text. And I mean that entirely as praise. It's dense, it's elevated, and inconsistent is a good word. Occasionally middling, but it has this very intense, mythic, almost biblical gravity to it. It feels ancient, like the language itself carries the weight. And then there's the newer 90s translation. Far more accessible, much smoother to read, much closer to the English text, much easier for modern readers to get through, and objectively, in many places, probably the more practical translation. But it loses some of that old world charm. That feeling that you're reading something excavated rather than written. It's interesting when you compare both translations. They succeed in very different ways. One prioritises atmosphere and grandeur, the other prioritises readability and clarity. And reading them back to back really highlighted how translation shapes not just meaning but the feeling of the same story. A different emotional architecture. Honestly, it made me appreciate Tolkien even more, which I didn't think was possible at this point, as I've spent enough hours in Middle-earth to probably to qualify for local residency. And finally, Dune by Frank Herbert. Reread. Still absolutely brilliant. Still one of the greatest science fiction novels ever written. And I know, saying that is hardly groundbreaking. That's not exactly a controversial literary take. It's the book equivalent of saying water is useful. But every time I revisit it, I'm stuck with just how much Herbert packs into it. Politics, religion, ecology, power, myth-making, colonial structures, manipulation, destiny. It's one of those books that somehow gets richer the more you experience being in it. And because I had so much to say, I ended up making a completely separate video on it that that probably somehow turned into something much longer than my average upload, which tends to happen whenever I'm talking about books I genuinely love. I tell myself to to hold back. Then 25 minutes of audio that I have to edit. And I'm still sitting there explaining why sandworms are basically perfect literary design, because, metaphors plus, evil, scary worms. So if you want my full thoughts on Dune, that video exists. And yes, I'm absolutely spiraling. So that's what I've been reading. A fairly normal and balanced reading month. If your definition of normal includes fantasy sequels, dark academia, memoirs, and repeatedly rereading major fantasy epics in Hebrew for reasons I don't really want to explain publicly. Honestly, I really enjoyed this stretch of reading. It reminded me that the best reading periods are usually the weird ones, and this one, but your choices make absolutely no sense when listed together, are usually the best. And that's when reading feels more alive. Anyway, let me know if what you've been reading lately, and more importantly, what's the strangest rabbit hole you've ever accidentally fallen into? Because I refuse to believe I'm the only one who making deeply questionable literary decisions at 1 a.m. If you enjoyed this, like, subscribe, leave a comment, and if you want to get really involved, consider joining this channel as a member on my Patreon. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.